Well, okay. We'll take care of that later. Okay, so thank you, Torrin. We're going to start with John's Gospel, chapter 9 today. I haven't read this for a while. Every time I turn to one of these, I think, well, we've read this before, but, you know, we're probably not going to find anything in the Bible to read that we haven't read before. And that would be remarkable. So, John's Gospel, chapter 9. This is, of course, in the ministry of Jesus, and verse 1 says, chapter 9, verse 1, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? Now, before we read the answer of Jesus, just consider what it is that the disciples are asking here. I think it reflects a misconception on their part, but I think it's a misconception that is shared by many people today, or many Christians, whether people are Christians or not. I think many people have the same misconception about God. I see three misconceptions in this, revealed by this question. Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? The first one is it assumes that God controls what happens in the external world, in this life that we're walking through. That's what they're sort of assuming. The second assumption is that the world is governed by some kind of divine justice. And related to that is that we as individuals, as human beings, are paying for our sins. And you see that reflected in their question. They're basically saying somebody sinned and God responded by striking this child with blindness. Of course, he's not a child now, but he's an adult. He was born blind, the text says. So they're assuming that somebody sinned and God responded, and so the things that you observe in life, it's God meting out justice, some kind of harsh, cruel retribution or injustice. It kind of reflects badly on God, you know, this sort of assumption. People do think that, though. And some people kind of strongly hold that God controls everything that happens. I don't know how a person can maintain that if you thought about it very long. All you have to say is, where was God during the Holocaust? And I don't think anyone's going to say he caused that to happen. Maybe somebody, but you see, God's not controlling what happened. Really, all you need to do is look at your own life and ask the question, is God controlling me like a puppet? Is he making me do things? We all know that's not true. And so if he's not controlling you, he's not controlling anybody. And he's not working in these external events that we confront in our lives. If you want to know where God's concerned with, where he's working and where he does work, don't look out here. Don't look in world events. Don't look at politics. Don't look at things out here. That's not where you see God work. Where God is concerned and where God works is in small things, on the inside of individuals. God's concern is not big events, you know, the things we watch on the news, the things we think are big. God is completely, as far as I'm concerned, I think it's safe to say, not active at all in those realms. What God's concerned about is in the lives of individuals, in the personal or internal lives of individuals one at a time. Not in big, highfalutin, mighty affairs of the world, but in the lives of humble people like you and me. Small things, small individual cares and concerns of our lives. And I think we see this reflected in this story. So let's go on reading. Those are the three misconceptions that they are expressing in this. And by the way, I think it's not just them. I don't think we can stand back and say, tisk, 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 you know, the dumb disciples. Hey, you know, Christians, I know from personal experience that Christians share these same misconceptions. Sometimes in our own lives. I know I had an experience one time walking out of a church with a man, and out of the blue, just, I don't know, to me or to who he was, for whose benefit he said this, he said, well, I know we've all got to pay for our sins, he said. And I don't know what was on his mind. He evidently, that sounds like a person with a guilty conscience about something. But that's not how Christians are supposed to view the thing. That's not how Christians are supposed to be thinking. But the disciples are thinking that. So they want to know who sinned. So they're trying to think like theologians here. Somebody must have sinned for God to have caused this to happen. But they're wrong on both accounts, as we're going to see. Not only is it not due to somebody's sin, it's also God didn't cause it to happen. So they ask this question of Jesus, this, for them, I guess, a hard theological question. And verse 3 says, Jesus answered, neither hath this man sinned nor his parents. Let's just pause there for a moment and consider what he said. Neither hath this man sinned, meaning the blind man, nor his parents. Now, here's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is not saying, we found the two perfect, or three maybe, we found the perfect individuals who are, besides me, have never done anything wrong. He's not saying they never sinned. He's not saying that they have lived perfect, exemplary lives and never committed a sin. What he is saying is, it's got nothing to do with it. There is no cause and effect. There is no retribution going on. He's not saying that they're perfect and sinless. He's saying that it has nothing to do with it. It has nothing to do with their sin, his sin, or theirs. Now, going on, the reason I pause there is because I want to talk about what happens next. And before I read it, I want to remind you that the King James translation is not holy. There's nothing divine or inspired about the King James translation per se. It's just the work of human beings who tried to translate the text the best they could out of the Greek language in which the text is originally recorded. There's nothing inspired about the word choice or the punctuation. Both are supplied by the translators. And I don't fault the King James translators. 400 years ago, a group of theologians under the instruction of King James in the Church of England, he wanted a new translation of the Bible, and they all got together. And it's an interesting story if you ever want to read about it, how the King James Bible was constructed and made, and the committees and the arguments over different word choices. And all of that's very, very interesting. But only to say it's the work of human beings. It's not inspired. And if you've ever seen a photograph, and you can see them online, of the Greek manuscripts from which we get our English translation, you'll notice something right away. You don't have to be a Greek scholar, you don't have to be an expert to observe this. If you look at photographs of the Greek manuscripts, what you'll see is that the letters are all, they don't have uppercase and lowercase, for one thing, and you also see there's no punctuation. It's just a string of letters, row by row. And that's how they were written. And so the translators have to look at that and sort out the words, and then they've got to supply the punctuation. Now, the reason I said all that and took all that time to tell you that is because I think they blew it in a big way here in this text, in this verse. And I want to say that up front before I read it, because I'm going to change their punctuation, because I think the way they punctuated it gives you a false impression. The very misconception that reflected by what the disciples said, which is, to me, manifestly not true. Now, here's what comes next. Okay, he said, neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, and then there's a colon, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him, period. Now, what that implies is, by the way they punctuated it, it implies that his blindness is not the result of his sin, but it implies that God made him blind so that the work of God could be revealed in him. Which, if you stop for a moment and just consider it just on the surface, doesn't even make sense. So they're saying God made him blind so that so that Jesus could come along and heal him. So in other words, God worked and made him blind so Jesus could come and work and take it away. In other words, so that Jesus could come and undo what God originally did. Now that, to me, it's like saying that so that God could pitch Jesus a softball and he could hit it out of the park and show how great he is, for publicity purposes, I guess. That's not what's happening, and that puts God in a very cruel light. That makes us say that this poor man had to suffer from, and think of his parents when their child is born blind, how they must have suffered, and this man growing up, how he must have suffered being born blind, and God, indifferent, said, oh, I made him blind so Jesus could come along years later and heal him and show how great Jesus is. So all that suffering is just so Jesus could show off. That's really what that's saying in this punctuation. But that period is not there in the original manuscript. So you have to get to the next verse, and by the way, the verses aren't there either, the verse numbers. See, you get a false impression because they made a second verse out of verse 4. Torrin, could you put up verse 4? I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day, the night cometh when no man can work. Now they made that a single sentence. What I think makes more sense is if you connect I must work the works of him that sent me, connect that with the previous verse. So Torrin, I'm going to read verse 3 straight into verse 4 as though it's one sentence without that period. So here's the way it goes. The disciples asked, who sinned? This man or his parents? So Jesus answered in verse 3, neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, period. That's how I'm repunctuating it. New sentence. I would put a new verse here. Capital B. But that the works of God should be made manifest in him, I must work the works of him that sent me. That's what I would call a single verse, a sentence. In other words, they ask a question, who sinned to cause him to be born blind? Jesus answered that neither he nor his parents sinned. New thought, new sentence. But that the works of God should be made manifest in him, I must work the works of him that sent me. Now to me that makes more sense, because that's what he's going to do. God didn't make the man blind to start with, but Jesus doesn't address why he's blind. He just says, I've come to work the works of him that sent me. And I think if you read it the other way, you get distracted and forget that Jesus has, see, the point he's making is, I've come into the world to do the work that God sent me to do, and it's to make things better. It's to heal. It's to fix. It's to restore. You know, in the book of Isaiah, there's a prophecy, and I should have looked this up. It pops into my mind, so I don't know the reference, but I'll quote it. Maybe you've heard it before. It's a prophecy of the Messiah, which is Jesus, of course. And it says, every mountain shall be made low, and every valley shall be exalted, and the crooked will be made straight. Now, when he's talking about geography like that, he doesn't mean out here in the world of mountains and hills. He metaphorically, the proud shall be humbled and the humble shall be exalted. And when he says the crooked shall be made straight, he's saying the things that are wrong will be made right. And that's what Jesus is here to do, to make what's wrong right again, to work in the lives of individuals to make things better, not to make things worse, but to make things better. So he says, so that the work of God, see, what I would say is the work of God has not yet been made manifest. The blindness is not the work of God. I think anybody who says God causes things like that to happen, well, you've got a cruel God, you know. I've talked to Christians who said that. I remember a man who was diagnosed with MS or something like that, one of these terrible diseases, and he said, well, God gave me this. No, God doesn't. First of all, God doesn't have any of that in heaven. Nobody's got dreaded diseases in heaven. God doesn't have any. And what kind of God are you imagining in your mind? You think God's distributing diseases to people. God didn't make this man blind for any purpose. God had nothing to do with it. He didn't give anybody diseases. He's not dealing in hurtful things. You know, Jesus said that himself. He said, if a child asks for a fish, will the father give him a serpent? Well, the answer is no, of course. And if he asks for bread, will he give him a stone? And Jesus makes this application. He says, if you, being carnal, or the King James says evil, if you, just being ordinary human beings, know how to treat your children rightly or give good things to your children, how much more is God better than you are? You know, he's not worse than we are. He doesn't have a worse moral code than we do. He's got a better, he's more loving, not worse. So, I must work the works of him that sent me. See, the work of God has not yet been seen. He says, I'm here to work the work of God. The blindness is not the work of God. See, I have come to work the work of him that sent me, so that the work of God will be made manifest, will be seen. Verse 5. As long as I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world. Well, thank goodness, some light finally comes along. Okay, verse 6. When he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and anointed the eyes. That's a fancy word, That's a pretty word. Anointed the eyes of the blind. It sounds so polite in the King James translation. Anointed the eyes of the blind. Really, he spit on the ground and he stirred it around with his finger and he jabbed his finger in the guy's eye with mud on it. So anoint, it kind of smooths over the real. Now, by the way, if you're trying to help people in any way, shape, or form, I don't recommend you do this yourself. But Jesus, that's what he did. And I'm sure the disciples were shocked. It doesn't say that in the text, but I can just imagine what they thought watching Jesus do this. I can just see the expression. Like, oh, what's he doing now? The guy's already blind, and now he sticks mud in his eye. But he hasn't come to make it worse. You have to keep that in mind. He says, I'm doing the work of him that sent me. So then he said in verse 7, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And John helps us out by saying, which is by interpretation, sent. In other words, there's this pool called sent, Siloam, which means by interpretation sent. So you could say that either that means, the reason he points that out is because Jesus sent him, or maybe it means this. Jesus is demonstrating why he was sent into the world. So I think that's the better explanation for why John points out why the pool is called sent. Jesus is demonstrating just why he is sent. And let's just back up and look at the big picture. Why is he sent? Not to straighten out our doctrine, not to put burdens on us and give us instructions, not to give some new laws, but to make things better in the lives of individuals, to heal, to take away burdens, to take away problems, to make the crooked places straight, to make the wrong right. That's why he's sent. So he sent this man to this pool. He went there, he went his way therefore and washed and came again seeing. Now we're going to stop right there, but if you go on reading, by the way, if you have time, I recommend to you to read the rest of the chapter, because if you don't think there's any humor in the Bible, well, you're mistaken, because it's actually a very funny account of what happens. Because the neighbors come and they say, well, what happened here? And he tells them what happened, and they said, yeah, but the Pharisees raise all these objections, and then and they get in a big fuss about it, and well, tell us again what happened. He said, I've told you once and you didn't believe it. There's a funny back and forth. And finally the man says, look, I'm no theologian. I'm paraphrasing. I'm no theologian, but this is what I know. I was blind and now I see. So you all go figure it out, figure out the theology, right? Because they get all mad about it, They didn't want to accept the fact that Jesus did this. It kind of exploded their theology. It's actually pretty funny. So the point about it is, What's the point of the whole thing? Well, Jesus came into the world. You know, by the way, he didn't do anything about the Roman Empire and all of its cruelty and all of its injustice. He left that alone. In fact, when he was called before Pilate, you know, the word was that Jesus was the King of the Jews. And Pilate asked him, "Are you a king?" And he says, "My kingdom is not of this world." In other words, he didn't have anything to do with all the injustice that was going on in the Roman Empire, and he didn't try to change that, and he didn't try to get rid of slavery in the Roman Empire and all the unjust things that were happening. He came to make things right in the lives of individuals. And that's what he was sent to do. Now, I think, I never like to read this without also reading the Message translation. So, Torrin, could you go back to verse 1? I think the Message, the translator of the Message, actually brings up a really good point, which I think we miss by just reading the King James. So we're going to read from verse 1. We already saw what happened, but I just want you to get something that you might have a thought or an idea that is implied in this account that you might have overlooked. But the translator of the Message, his name is Eugene H. Peterson, he very shrewdly saw something in this text that he brings out. So in verse 1, walking down the street, Jesus saw a man blind from birth. Okay. His disciples asked, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, causing him to be born blind?" You see, that's the question we were dealing with before. Somebody's got to be at fault here. Who sinned? Was it him? Hard to see how it was him if he was born that way. But who knows, in the world of theology, it gets pretty tangled. Maybe his parents did something wrong. That's what they're asking. Okay, look at the answer here. Jesus said, "You're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame." Now stop right there. See, that's what I think is just a brilliant thought that the translator of the Message brings out. It shows some psychological insight into the human condition. He says, when you ask a question like that, you're really asking the wrong question. You're looking at it all wrong. You're assuming that somebody sinned. He says, you're looking for someone to blame. Now, just bear with me for a second. I think in our regular everyday lives, we tend to do that. Either someone else to blame or we ourselves to blame. When something happens, we want to say, what did I do wrong that caused this to happen? And sometimes Christians are very helpful, and they'll try to tell you you did something wrong. Let's see, the fancy spiritual way to say it is you left the door open somewhere. That makes you sound real wise, You left a door open somewhere. Well, what do you mean by that? Oh, I don't know, just. Well, where are these doors? And why are they open? Where are they shut? It's just nonsense. May I say that? Christians speak a lot of nonsense sometimes. So just, that's such a dumb idea. You left a door open. Well, you don't have any doors. You don't leave doors open. There aren't any doors. Jesus here says, I think this is right. I think that he's got it exactly right. He says, you're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There isn't any answer to that question, who sinned? Well, in a theological way, you could say, well, everybody sinned. So if God were going to, mete out retribution, then everybody should get this. Everybody should, because everybody's guilty in some way, shape, or form. But he says, what he's saying is, you're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. In other words, you shouldn't. You shouldn't look for someone to blame. What did I do wrong? Well, maybe nothing, or maybe something, but there's no cause and effect. That's what he says next. There is no such cause and effect here. Okay, let's deal with that first. First he says, don't look for some reason why. There's no cause and effect here. Don't look for someone to blame, either yourself or somebody else. There's no relation. There's no causal relationship. There's no cause and effect. Before we go on, I think I can't tell you how many times I've heard that kind of thinking among Christians. I remember we attended the church in Mino for a while before we started this church, what do they call it? Faith Center. And the original pastor was Monty Anderson. His brother Cody is the pastor now. And Monty was killed in a car accident. Deer crossing the road, and a car veered to miss the deer and hit Monty head on, and he was killed. And I remember at the funeral service or the memorial service, people were asking, well, why did God allow this to happen? Well, see, if you ask Jesus that, he'd say, you're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. Kind of looking for God to blame. Why did God allow this to happen? Well, there's no answer to that. There's no sorting it out. You can't, there's no point in asking that question. And there isn't any answer to it. And there wasn't any door left open, and there wasn't any causal relationship. But here's what Jesus says. You're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There's no cause and effect. Now get this next part. Look instead for what God can do. In other words, why it happened is immaterial. Here we are. Now let's talk about what God can do. So the whole point of this story is Jesus has been sent to carry out the will of God, and he comes into a world in which there's a lot of things gone haywire, a lot of bad things happen, a lot of things are not right, but Jesus has come to make the crooked straight, or make the wrong right, or to make things better, is the way I like to say it. Not to make things worse, but to make things better. Look instead for what God can do. Okay, let's get the next verse. We need to be energetically at work for the one who sent me here, working while the sun shines. When the night falls, the workday is over. Okay? I guess we might as well get the whole story. For as long as I'm in the world, there's plenty of light. I'm the world's light. Okay? Let's see how the Message tells us this rest of the story. He said this, and then he spit in the dust and made a clay paste with the saliva. It's almost very scientific there. And rubbed the paste in the blind man's eyes. Okay? And he said, go wash at the pool of Siloam. Siloam means sent. And the man went and washed, and he saw. Well, there you have it. Jesus is demonstrating what God's all about. And it's about making things better, not making things worse. Let's read one more while we're on the subject. This one is one of my favorite passages. This is in Luke's Gospel, chapter 9. And once again, the disciples trying to think like theologians, and they get on the wrong foot. That happens a lot with them, it seems like. And not just them. We can't wag our finger at the disciples and say, dumb disciples. I mean, Christians today make the same mistakes over and over again. Luke chapter 9, I'm starting with verse 51. Okay, back to King James translation. Verse 51, Luke chapter 9, verse 51. Remember, Jesus came to make things right, to make things better. It came to pass, when the time was come that he should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. That's because that's where it was all going to play out. Verse 52, and he sent messengers before his face, and they went and entered into a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. Verse 53, and they did not receive him, because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem. So, he sent messengers to go ahead and prepare. What that means is, I think, that he sent people ahead to make accommodations for them. In other words, a place to spend the night, food and so forth, just to make preparations. But the Samaritans, when they heard that he's going to Jerusalem, they said, well, in other words, just keep on moving. You can't stay here. Just, they shut the doors and they wouldn't give them. That's what I assume is what's saying here. And, you have to keep in mind that there was animosity between the Samaritans and the Jews. That goes all the way back to a time just after the death of Solomon, where the kingdom was divided. 10 tribes in the north, they called their kingdom Israel. 2 tribes in the south, they called it Judah. In the south, they had Jerusalem and the temple of God. In the north, there was this war, this civil war, this division in the north. They didn't have Jerusalem, they didn't have the temple of God, so they made their own capital. They called it Samaria. or was Samaria, and they made their own temple, a rival temple. And so that made the Jews hate them, and the Samaritans in turn hated them, and so they hate each other for theological reasons, for racial reasons, and so this division or this hatred is still going on, both racial and cultural and religious. They're hostile to one another. So these Samaritans are very proud of the fact that they've got their own thing, their own religious worship in Samaria, and the Jews have Jerusalem and the temple. So when they heard Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, they just, got all standoffish and said, well, if you're going to Jerusalem, we'll just keep on going. We're not going to have anything to do with you. So the disciples of Jesus, how did they respond to that? In verse 54, when the disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias did? Now they're referring to a story right out of the Old Testament when Elias is the Greek way of saying Elijah. Elijah is a Hebrew name, and the translation that we're reading here is Greek, and so Elias is a Greek form of the same word, but it's Elijah. And in the Old Testament, yes, Elijah did call down fire from heaven, and it was dealing with Samaritans at the same time. The king of Samaria, it's in the book of 2 Kings, the king of Samaria fell through the roof and got hurt, and he got his messengers and he sent them he said, go to Ekron and inquire of Beelzebub whether I will recover of this illness. And so they sent these messengers to this town of Ekron to inquire of Beelzebub whether he would be healed of this illness. And Elijah interrupted the messengers of the king of Samaria, and he said, go back and tell the king, you don't need to go all the way to Ekron. You don't need to inquire of Beelzebub. I'll tell you what God says. Go back and tell the king, no, you won't recover. You'll die. And so they came back, and the king said, what are you doing back so soon? And they said, well, we met a man in the way, and he told us, go back and tell the king, you're not going to recover. He said, what did this guy look like? I'm paraphrasing. I'm giving you the Reader's Digest version. What did he look like? Well, he was a hairy man. He said, oh, I know who that was. That was Elijah. And so he sent not just messengers, but his soldiers. And they said, go get this guy, 50 soldiers. And we'll see who's toughest here, Kings don't like to be told anything that contradicts them. And so it sent the soldiers, and the soldiers said, found Elijah sitting up on a hill, and they said, man of God, come down. And they said, oh, well, if I'm a man of God, then let's see fire come down from heaven and burn you all up. That's my paraphrase. He didn't speak Southern like that, but burn you guys up. So fire came down from heaven and burned them up. And so the disciples, remembering this Bible story, are going to apply the scriptural precedent, and it's right there in the Bible, right there in the Old Testament. God's the same God in their mind, everything's the same. So if God burned up the Samaritans back then in, the instructions of Elijah, we've got somebody greater than Elijah, and same Samaritans, they haven't learned their lesson yet. So they said, hey, Jesus, I know what would be really good. They won't receive us. Why don't you command fire to come down from heaven? Well, they didn't say you. They said we will. They're putting themselves as the disciples of Jesus in this position. And so they're saying, I know what would be a good solution to this deal. Let's call down fire from heaven and burn them all up. That's what happened in the Old Testament. Well, just because things happened in the Old Testament doesn't mean they should be happening now. It also says in the Old Testament you should burn witches. So, there was a time when the Puritans thought, well, it happened in the Old Testament, we should do the same thing. Well, that was a shameful chapter in history when they did that. But it's right there. It is in the Old Testament. And the disciples are applying the scriptural precedent. It's right there. It's in black and white. It's in the Bible. It's in the Old Testament. So shall we call down fire from heaven? Verse 55. He turned and rebuked them. He didn't commend them. He rebuked them. And he said, you know not what manner of spirit you are of. He implies here that they are speaking prompted by some kind of a bad spirit, which they were, by the way. Verse 56, here's why. For the Son of Man is not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And he went to another village. Now, what's the point? The point is he hasn't come to make things worse. He's come to make things better. He's come to make the crooked places straight He's come to make the wrong things right. And he works in the lives of individuals. He's not calling down fire from heaven. He's not calling down retribution. He's not bringing judgment. He's making things better, and that's what he came to do. And here's the application. First of all, apply it to yourself. Quit looking for someone or something to blame, and certainly don't blame yourself for anything. His plan is the same for you as it was for these stories we just read, to make things better. Like we read from the message. You're asking the wrong question. You don't need to know why. All you need to know is, what can God do? Well, what can he do is he came to make things better. He wants to make things better for you. Secondly, here's the second application. No need to look for someone to blame in the lives of others. In other words, freely forgive those around you, just like God has freely forgiven you, and understand that God would like to. His role for you and me is to make things better in the lives of others, not to make things worse, but to make things better. And I think if you have that very simple perspective on things, you can see things a lot more clearly. For instance, let's just read an example, and then I think I'm done. Colossians chapter 3, verse 8. Look at these instructions from the Apostle Paul. Colossians chapter 3, verse 8. He's writing to the Colossians, and in the second half of his letters, that's where we are now, he tries to give practical advice to his Christian readers. So here, let's just see what he says here. Now, you also put off these things. Now, look at what the first thing he says is. You also put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy communications out of your mouth. You notice the first thing he said is anger and wrath. No need for that in a life of a Christian. Anger, wrath, malice. Verse 9 says, lie not to one another, seeing that you have put off the old man and his deeds. Verse 10 says, and have put on the new man, which is renewed in knowledge after the image of him that created him. In other words, we find out what the new life is all about by understanding, coming to know what the image of, you could say, Christ or God is, what his personality is really like. Verse 11 says, where there is neither Greek nor Jew. Greek is, he doesn't mean racial, people born in Greece. He means Gentiles. There's no difference between Gentiles and Jews. That distinction is over. No difference between circumcision and uncircumcision. That was the ritual that distinguished Jews from Gentiles. That division is gone. Barbarian, Scythian, these racial differences. They called people who were not Greeks but were nevertheless not Jews. They called them barbarians, people in the north especially. Scythians, no difference at all, bond or free, but Christ is all and in all. Verse 12, he's telling you what to put off. All these negative things having to do with retribution and anger and those sort of things. Put those away, but here's what you put on. Put on, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercies. Now, this is 400-year-old language of the King James. We don't talk that way anymore. Nobody goes around saying bowels of mercy. It sounds kind of weird. It means a heart of compassion. Let's say it that way. Nobody said, and I'm glad, by the way. I'm glad we don't talk that way. Bowels of mercy just sounds kind of creepy and weird. Bowels of mercies means a heart of compassion. So he says, put this on. Heart of compassion, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering. You see, I think these are attributes that mean more to God than a lot of the things we think of as like that we put all the emphasis on, in the Christian life, that we think are the important. These are the important things. Kindness. It seems like such a small thing, but it's not. Humbleness of mind, meekness. Because these are the characteristics of Christ. These are his personality traits. Verse 13 says, forbearing one another. That means bearing with one another. Forgiving one another. That's such a simple instruction, I don't know what's so hard about that. once again, I remember having conversation with this man. I'll just tell you, we used to have these meetings they called Promise Keepers, and it was meant to for a bunch of men to get together and make them better men, better husbands, better fathers. And the thought was that by getting together and talking out all these issues, men from different churches and different theological backgrounds. And so, we had these meetings for a while, and because everyone came from different churches, they brought with them all of their baggage, all their theological baggage, and what ended up happening was everyone just talked from their corner, from their theological corner, and it ended up just being a lot of unprofitable conversation, just to be perfectly honest with you. But I remember talking to this one particular man one time, and listen, this is what he said. I'm quoting now verbatim. He says, "I know the Bible says we're supposed to forgive, but I can't." Well, what do you want me to say to that? So, see, I was trying to argue from the point of view of what, I wouldn't say argue, but I was counteracting what I said. Well, the New Testament says that God has already forgiven you, and so we should act like God, since God has already forgiven you because of Christ. Christ took away your sins, so He's already forgiven you. We're supposed to reflect that and turn around and show others the same kind of compassion that God showed us, and if He forgave us, we can forgive others. And he says, well, I know the Bible says we're supposed to forgive, but I can't forgive. What he's really saying is, I won't. But I don't know what's so hard about it. I don't know what the issue was. I didn't just, So if a person could be stubborn about it, I don't know what to do with you, But he's given us very simple instructions here. Forbearing one another, forgiving one another, if any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so do ye also. You get that point? Christ's already forgiven you. See, if you have a problem forgiving someone, just forget about it. And instead, look at how Christ has freely forgiven you and concentrate on that, meditate on that. And when you get your heart full of how Christ has forgiven me personally, then it'll be easier for you to forgive someone else. You just need to forget about other people for a little while and look at. See, I think a person like that hasn't really understood what happened at the cross. Even as Christ forgave you, so do you also. We're supposed to mirror or demonstrate or follow through with the attributes of Christ. In other words, what's the fundamental thought here? Jesus came into the world. He was sent into the world to make things better, not to make them worse, but to make them better. Verse 14, above all these things put on charity. Now that doesn't mean like charity like the Salvation Army and dump your old clothes at the secondhand store. That doesn't mean charity like that. It means love. That's a word, the word there is agape. It means love, God's kind of love, which is the bond of perfectness. Verse 15, and let the peace of God rule in your hearts. That's where that song that we sing comes from. Let the peace of God rule in your hearts. That's such a good thought. Let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you're called in one body, and be ye thankful. Okay, I think that's all we got today.